To answer the question everybody asks, I'll just start by saying, yes, I had a great trip. Yes, I've got a lot of stories to share. Yes, I've got a lot of faith experiences that I'm going to impart to you. Hopefully, you're going to all come to the welcome back party on Friday and hear the bagpipes. You've been warned. Hopefully, you've all read some of my blog. I'm going to continue to be writing some of those pieces now that I'm back and have some time to process and even follow up on some of my daily journaling and writing. You've been prayed for. I think one of the most powerful things on my trip was that time set apart where it wasn't that I had to do all these checkbox of things, these daily tasks, but I actually was able to spend time in prayer and prayer for each of you. How many of you, Jody asked about vacations. Did you guys all get a chance to vacation or travel or do something this summer a little bit? Okay. Let me ask, did everything go smoothly? Does everything always go smoothly when we travel? Can you just anticipate something is going to go a little askew, right? Let me give you one story just to set the stage for some of my travel. I've got more than a few stories to share, but this is something that took place the last night that I was there. There's a guy named Robert who I took bagpipe lessons with. He's a truck driver, and he called me on the last day that I was there. Actually, I met him in Edinburgh for dinner with his wife one day while I was there. And then he called me on the last day and says, how about coming over to our house? We're not taking no for an answer. We want to have you over for dinner the last night before you go home. I said, that'd be great. Now, he said, I'll pick you up at 6:30. And it ended up being 8:30. He's a truck driver, and the schedule it didn't work out. So it was 8:30, he picked me up, and it was a half-hour ride to his house, and by the time we ate, and by the time there was some other things, picking his sister up and all this other, I got back to the house at 1 a.m., and had to get on the bus at 4 a.m. I had to pack somewhere in the middle, get on the bus at 4 a.m. to get to the airport. So you kind of get an idea for that last day, but he picked me up, and when he picks me up, he gets his phone call from his wife, and you guys know how this goes, right? And she calls and says, so what time are you going to be there? What time do I need to have the food ready? And what about this and this and this? And he's giving her all these answers. And then he leans over to me and he looks at me and says, my wife wants to know, do you like carrots? Now, okay, first of all, you have to understand he's from Glasgow, so he's got this heavy Glaswegian accent. And if you to give you a little idea, it's kind of like they forget their consonants at times. And I kind of got used to where I thought I understood almost everything that they were saying, whether it was in Glasgow or the East Coast is a completely different accent. But so he leans over and says, my wife wants to know, do you like carrots? And I said, yeah, I like carrots. Yeah, sure. And I look at him and says, actually, the truth is, I've eaten everything while I've been here. I've loved all the food that I've had. I'll pretty much eat anything that you put in front of me. Now, you know the point in the conversation when something goes wrong, when all of a sudden his eyes go, woo, like, whoa, what did you just say? And then he instead of looking at me or instead of putting his phone up to his ear and talking, you know how somebody gets really intent and they feel like they've got to make eye contact? So instead of putting their phone to their ear, they look at their phone like they've got to make eye contact with the person on the other side and say, hey, honey, you better lock them in the bedroom. He says he'll eat our cats. I thought he said carrots. He was asking if I like cats. Not everything gets communicated clearly when you're on the road. Not every road sign is clear, and you don't always know what's going to happen. You know you're going to get delays. You know you're going to miss a flight or a bus or something. I had more than a few, between dialects, misunderstandings. I felt like I was deaf at times, looking at people's mouths to make sure I was hearing what they were saying. But I learned how important it was to pay attention and how important it was to be flexible. When you travel, there's different ways of traveling, isn't there? There's traveling as a tourist or traveling as a pilgrim or an immigrant or an explorer, maybe a missionary. Some of you go on family trips or business trips. As a tourist, you go and maybe you can even use Google Maps, or you can go to a tourist station and you can find all these brochures and figure out, I want to go to this castle, I want to see this museum, I want to do all these things and see these places. But it's different if you're an immigrant, isn't it? Or if you're a pilgrim. You're going to a new place to kind of enmesh yourself in the culture, to become a part of the community. It's a different mindset. If you are traveling as an explorer, you're not that engaged in the culture, but you want to find the new things, the things that have been undiscovered. Missionaries have a purpose. Family visits have a purpose. Business travel has a purpose. And they're not all the same. You need to know your purpose before you go somewhere, don't you? A missionary, by the way, missionaries are not allowed in every country. Immigration, you can't just immigrate somewhere without going through procedures, without knowing what's appropriate or what the culture expects. Exploring, by the way, there's some places that it's illegal to explore without permits. Tourism, they like that because usually they're getting your money. Business is usually seen as mutually beneficial. But knowing your purpose is what makes a difference, isn't it? By the way, in customs, going through customs, it's important that you know your purpose when you travel as well, because they ask you, don't they? Were you traveling on business? Were you traveling on leisure? By the way, coming back from Scotland, I found out that there's a whole other category at customs. There's a category of business and leisure. There's also the category of if you leave the country with your passport and no beard, and then you show back up trying to come back into the country with the beard, that's another whole category that guarantees you will miss your next flight. Knowing your purpose is important. Knowing where you're going, knowing how you're getting there, knowing where you're staying, that's important, isn't it? In fact, I come to believe that in America, most of us don't plan our vacations without knowing where we're going, how long we're staying, where we're staying, maybe even have the restaurants planned, maybe even planned all the places we're going to visit, the museums, the tourist places we're going to visit. We have every detail planned, don't we? That's not always the way it goes in other places. When I look at this passage, I find out that Paul understood travel a little different. In fact, if you read the New Testament, you read Paul, you find out Paul was maybe kind of a type A personality, wasn't he? Paul liked things to be done a certain way. He was pretty specific. In fact, he had disagreements with people who didn't think the way he thought. We might understand that. But then we get to this passage in Corinthians, and he's talking about his future plans and what he's going to do, and we find out it's much more vague, much more ambiguous. What is he going to do? He's writing from Ephesus, and he says, hey, I'm going to stay through Pentecost because some really good things are happening, but there's conflict. But it's good stuff, and he's not afraid to stay there and do what's important even in the midst of the challenge. But then he says, I'm going to travel through Macedonia. I don't know when, but I'll be passing through there. I'm convinced I'm supposed to. And he says, and I'm going to show up and I'm going to visit you guys, but I want to stay for a while. I don't just want to pass through. I want to stay with you for a while. I may even winter with you. I'm not sure. And then I want you to help me with my next part of the journey. I'm not sure where I'm going either, but I want you to help me with that. Now, put this in context. This would be like me saying, hey, guys, we've got a missionary coming next year. Not sure when he's going to show up. Not sure where he's going. Not sure how long he's going to stay, but he needs a house to stay in. Anybody want to open your house and let him stay? Have you ever seen some of those shows where they can't get the renters out of the house? You just get nervous and not sure what the plans are. Paul, for a type A personality, all of a sudden shows that his travel plans are very vague. Very flexible. We find out that it's not about the calendar, it's not about the clock, it's not about a specific agenda. No, it's about the purpose of doing what he's called to do and do it where he's called to be. What does it look like to travel without knowing tomorrow where you're going to sleep? By the way, when I was traveling, I traveled using planes and trains and ferries and buses and even hitchhiking a few times. And there were times I'd wake up in the morning and I wasn't sure where I was sleeping at night. Now, I had a tent just in case. But I found out that I wasn't the only one that traveled that way. There was times I would get in and I'd get the last room in a hostel, and then a family with kids would show up and they're looking for a room that they haven't booked. Over and over, many nights in a row, I found that people were just going. was almost a different cultural type of travel and experiencing and not even sure where they were going to be. Different than our culture. I stayed in, I said I took my tent with me. I stayed in my tent many nights, some through hiking, some very scenic places, beautiful places, very lonely places. But I found out that they have this thing over there called right to roam. And right to roam means you can camp anywhere as long as you're not damaging crop, as long as you're not doing damage to somebody's property, you can camp. And they're pretty proud that they've got this. But to give you context, this is, you walk up to somebody's farm here in America, and you can see the cows and whatnot out in the field, and you might see a sign at the fence post somewhere that says no trespassing, right? In fact, literally it might say, if you trespass, you will be shot. Correct? In Scotland, you show up at a fence like that, and it says, please close the gate behind you. Please keep your dog on a leash. Dogs can kill lambs. Once in a while, it'll have the warning, beware of the bull. And that's fair. I mean, if you're going to walk in their field, you should at least know that there's a bull in there, right? But you can walk anywhere. In fact, the first time I came to a fence like that in American culture, I was like, no, I can't walk through that. But literally, the trail, the path walks through people's yards, through people's properties. And so you kind of get used to opening the gate and closing the gate and continuing walking. It is right to roam. It's an understanding that it doesn't belong to me, it belongs to us. It was kind of beautiful. I stayed in hostels. And you get to a hostel. How many of you have slept in hostels before? Good, several. Stayed in one in Chicago before this, but I get to Scotland, and it's very different. And there's the age range is wide, and the group range is different. The diversity of people is different. And I stayed in rooms with 8 people or 12 people. One place I stayed in a room with 16 total strangers. And you find yourself crossing culture and paths, and you hear stories. And in one place, I sat down with somebody, and they began sharing life with me in stories of tragedy, loss of his daughter. And I found myself realizing people are hungry for relationship. They need somebody to stand beside them in the midst of life, to help guide them on the path of life itself. I experienced many things, everything from conference events, staying in the Abbey on Iona, to festival events, camping in a tent with 20,000 other people, to private rooms. By the way, I think the thing I disliked the most was staying in a hotel room by myself. I also stayed in people's homes. I did that thing I told some of you about, couch surfing, where I put myself online and I said I was going to be in these areas. Would you be willing to host me? I slept in total strangers' homes. And by the way, they're no longer strangers. I'm friends with all of them on Facebook and on couch surfing. And we've been messaging back and forth. I'm praying for a guy who's got an upcoming doctor's appointment on the 20th. I stayed with people musicians, somebody who actually played at that concert of 20,000. Stayed at a police officer's home. I stayed with a fisherman, a ghillie who is a guide. I stayed with teachers and with a doctor and with a truck driver. I encountered life and I encountered real people on the road of life. And it was because I was willing to be flexible. I didn't have a set plan. I wasn't going and had to do this or this, but I was willing to say, God, lead me in this time. I learned it's not about how you get there. It's not even about when you get there or where you're going, but what it is about the most is it's about why. What's my purpose? For Paul, it wasn't about the when or the how or the why. It was about why is he going? Why is he staying? What is his purpose for today? And I came back convinced that we should know that about each and every day of our life. It doesn't make a difference if you're going to Disney World or if you're traveling to a different country. It doesn't make a difference if you're just getting up and going to work today. The most important thing you can know is your why. Why? Paul's ministry was focused on effective and flexible time, going where the Holy Spirit led. And in my renewal time, I experienced solitude and silence, simplicity, and I experienced time of prayer, and I was able to go as the Spirit led. I came back affirming the fact that our mission statement is being Christ in community. Knowing that my purpose every day is to get up and to be Christ in whatever circumstance to every person that I can be. And believing that God's purpose in your life is the same, to be Christ in every experience, whether at work or at home and in family. Be Christ to those who you encounter. See, it's not as important knowing where we're going to sleep even tomorrow night. In fact, I began to ask myself the question, what would it look like if every day I didn't have some of these answers? I didn't know where I would sleep. And there are people in our own community who don't have those answers. What would it look like if I didn't know where I was going or when I was going to arrive, but all I knew was my purpose? And I began to realize Jesus kind of talked about this too. You know, in Luke chapter 9, his disciples say, hey, Jesus, we're going to follow you. Wherever you go, whatever you do, we're going to follow you. What's it going to take? And he begins to talk about the cost of following, the cost of taking up your cross. But he says this in Luke chapter 9:58. He says, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And sometimes following Christ means we really don't have that answer. We don't know what tomorrow looks like. We don't know where tomorrow's going to lead us. We don't know what path God's going to open for us. But if we're faithful and if we're willing to follow, if we're willing to be present and fully live into our purpose, we'll be exactly where God wants us. Maybe I should ask this. Would you rather know your purpose in life with little specifics? Or would you rather have a busy agenda, a full calendar, but no purpose? And the truth is, I think a lot of Americans specifically, I think we're trained this way. We're trained to have a busy calendar, to have our schedule cram-packed full. And even when we've got a little empty space of time, we begin to think, how can I fill that? I've got to do something. And we just keep our life so full that we don't even take time or have time to say, God, I'm here with you now. Or say, God, I'm going to take some time and pray. Or, God, what do you want me to do? Or, who do I need to call? We've given up our purpose for busyness. And I think it's more important to be willing to give up our busyness for God's purpose. I'm going to guess that most of us are so busy, in fact, we haven't taken the time to slow down and ask ourselves, what is my purpose? We probably don't remember the last time we asked ourselves, God, do I have a purpose? What's my purpose today? And I'm going to challenge you to think about that. In fact, I'm going to specifically ask you for this week and next week, I'm going to be talking a little bit about travel tips for life. I want you to be thinking about some of these things. What would it look like if you got up tomorrow and instead of thinking about your agenda or your calendar, you asked the question, God, what is my purpose today? What would it change if it wasn't as important to know what you were going to do, but to know who you were going to be? Christ in community, Christ to your neighbor, Christ to your family. I want you to think about how can the church be a part of that? How can you transform your faith from just a checkbox or another thing on the calendar, a part of the schedule which just fills Sunday morning? How can you convert your faith to just a checkbox to something that takes place every day? Something that fills your moments, that fills your breath. I want you to think about being a part of a life group, being a part of a small group. We've got several that have been meeting. I know Dick's still meeting. We'll be starting up the one that I was a part of here in the next week. If you're interested, talk to me. I'll get you connected. Think about being a part of Walk to Emmaus. Maybe that's something that will encourage you or deepen your faith or help you take that next step. Maybe you want to be a part of some of the missions and service. Talk to me or talk to Denise, who's heads up our missions group, when she gets back. If you're interested in helping lead worship, whether it's with music or, by the way, you should be warned, I'm planning on incorporating dramas into the worship again. If you're interested in helping me with that, let me know, because that's going to be happening. If you have other gifts or you have other leadership desires or you just have other questions and want to know how you can take that next step, please talk to me. Send me an email, give me a phone call, talk to me in the hall. Because I believe the most precious thing we can give to each other and we can give back to God is knowing our purpose. I encourage you. Make God your purpose each and every day. Even though life's going to throw you detours, curves, slow down, speed limits in the road of life, even though your plane may be delayed or you may miss a flight or something may not happen the way you want it to every day, don't think that that's putting you off track. In fact, maybe that's God's plan for you to be where God wants you to be, when God wants you to be there, that you might meet someone else on the road. Brothers and sisters, we have a purpose. And that purpose is to be Christ to the world.